Get out of my house. The HOA, Karen screamed this at me while I was moving my couch into my own lake cabin. She called the cops immediately, but when the officer arrived, he asked her a question that made my blood freeze. For 7 days, this woman turned my life into absolute hell with harassment, lies, and neighborhood warfare. I almost gave up and moved away. But then I accidentally discovered her secret and realized she'd been making payments to the one person who could destroy her life. Comment where you're watching because what happens next will make you question everything about karma. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I thought I had life figured out. 32 years old, I just sold my sporting goods chain for $800,000, and I was ready to live the dream. You know what the dream was? A lake cabin where I could fish, relax, and pretend I was some kind of wilderness expert instead of a guy who'd spent the last 10 years selling sneakers and baseball gloves. $280,000 for my slice of paradise at Whispering Pines Lake. The plan was foolproof. Retire early, enjoy the good life, maybe write a book about entrepreneurship or something equally ridiculous. Oh, and I'd bought one rental property 6 months earlier through my LLC, Northern Lakes Property Management, just to diversify my investments. Nothing fancy, just passive income from some house I'd never even visited. Saturday morning, I'm directing the movers like I'm orchestrating a symphony. Couch goes by the window, TV stands over there, boxes marked kitchen go-to. Well, you get it. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. Living my best retired at 32 life. When suddenly this woman comes flying across the street like her pants are on fire. And I mean flying. Full sprint, arms pumping, designer workout gear that probably costs more than most people's rent. She's got this professional camera around her neck, which should have been my first red flag. And the kind of righteous fury in her eyes that usually belongs to people who've just witnessed a war crime. Excuse me, she screams before she's even reached my driveway. Not hello or welcome to the neighborhood. Straight to volume 11, accusation mode. What do you think you're doing? Now, I'm a pretty reasonable guy, so I figure this is just a case of mistaken identity. Or maybe she's having some kind of medical emergency. I'm moving into my cabin, I say, trying to keep things friendly because, hey, we're going to be neighbors, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. This woman, Crystal Stewart, though I didn't know her name yet, starts taking pictures of me like I'm some kind of exotic criminal. She's discovered in her pristine suburban habitat. Click, click, click. Me holding my couch, the moving truck, my freaking mailbox. This is my neighborhood, she announces. And I swear she said it like she was declaring ownership of a sovereign nation. I've lived here for 12 years and I know exactly who belongs here and who doesn't. And then she catches herself like her mouth just wrote a check her brain wasn't ready to cash and quickly adds I've been the HOA president here for 12 years. But that slip, that little I've lived here correction, that was clue number 1 that Crystal Stewart was hiding something big. Here's what really freaked me out. This woman knew things about my cabin that I didn't even know yet. She mentioned the previous owners by name, talked about some deck repair that happened 2 years ago, and even knew about the new water heater that wasn't visible from the street. Either Crystal was some kind of neighborhood surveillance expert, or she had a personal connection to my property that went way deeper than HOA presidential duties. The way she looked at my cabin wasn't the look of a concerned neighbor. It was the look of someone staring at something they thought belonged to them. 20 minutes into this absolute circus, Crystal makes the phone call that's going to change both our lives forever. She pulls out her cell phone like she's drawing a weapon and dials 911 right there in front of me. Yes, officer, she says in this dramatic voice that belongs on a soap opera. There's a man here claiming to own a house that I know he doesn't own. He has moving trucks and everything. I think this might be some kind of elaborate theft situation. I'm standing there with my mouth hanging open, holding my legal documents, watching this woman report me for the crime of moving my own furniture into my own house. It was like being stuck in some twisted reality show where the prize is getting arrested for homeownership. Officer Danny Harris rolls up about 30 minutes later, and I can tell immediately that this isn't his first Crystal Stewart rodeo. The guy has this look, you know, the one like a teacher who's dealing with that one kid who always causes problems but somehow never gets expelled. Professional but tired. Really, really tired. "Ma'am," he says to Crystal. And here's the line that should have made everything click for me. "I've responded to several tenant calls from your address." What seems to be the problem here? Tenant calls from Crystal's address. If she owned her house like she was claiming, why the hell would there be tenant disputes? But Crystal's already redirecting Harris's attention to me, demanding that he arrest me for trespassing, fraud, identity theft, and probably jaywalking while he's at it. The woman had quite an imagination when it came to my alleged criminal activities. I pull out my paperwork like I'm presenting evidence at trial. Deed, mortgage documents, insurance papers, title transfer, everything that proves I legally own this cabin. Harris checks it all, runs my ID, and even calls the title company just to be thorough. Meanwhile, Crystal's getting more and more agitated as it becomes crystal clear, pun intended, that I'm exactly who I say I am. There has to be some mistake, she keeps saying, like reality is just going to rearrange itself if she complains loudly enough. This was supposed to be my retirement home. People like him don't belong in neighborhoods like this. People like him. There it was, the mask slipping just enough to show me what I was really dealing with. Crystal Stewart wasn't just a concerned neighbor or an overzealous HOA president. She was something much worse, and I was starting to get a really clear picture of what my peaceful lake retirement was about to become. Harris wraps up his investigation and turns to Crystal with the kind of barely contained irritation that suggests this conversation has happened before. "Ma'am, Mr. Mitchell here is the legal owner of this property. If you continue to harass him or interfere with his legal right to occupy his own home, I'll have to file charges against you for harassment." Crystal's maze goes through more emotions than a soap opera star in a season finale. Shock, anger, denial, and then this calculating look that makes my skin crawl. "This isn't over," she says, pointing her finger at me like she's casting some kind of curse. "I know people. I have connections. And I will not let my neighborhood be destroyed by people like you." She storms back to her house, muttering under her breath about property values and community standards, leaving me standing there feeling like I just survived a natural disaster. The movers are looking at me like I hired them to work in a war zone. And Officer Harris is shaking his head like he's seen this movie before and knows how it ends. He hands me his card and gives me the kind of advice that should have scared me more than it did. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. Crystal Stewart has called us out here more times than I can count. You might want to install some security cameras and document everything. Something tells me this lady isn't done with you yet. But here's what I couldn't figure out. If Crystal owned her house like she claimed, why did Officer Harris keep getting tenant dispute calls from her address? What was Crystal Stewart really hiding?" The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone taking pictures outside my window. It was 6 a.m. on a Sunday, and there was Crystal Stewart, still in her pajamas with that same professional camera documenting what she probably called evidence of my various crimes against the neighborhood. When I stepped outside to ask her what the hell she was doing, she just smiled this fake sweet smile and said, "Just making sure everything's up to HOA standards, neighbor. You wouldn't want to be in violation of our community guidelines, would you?" Now, let me tell you something about HOA guidelines. They're like the tax code, but written by people who peaked in high school student government. Crystal had apparently memorized every single rule, regulation, and possible interpretation thereof. Over the next 3 days, I received 8 official violation notices. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My landscaping was excessive and non-conforming. Apparently, the previous owner's flower beds were now somehow illegal. My window treatments were unauthorized modifications, even though I'd literally just hung some basic curtains. The woman was creating violations out of thin air. But the violation notices were just the beginning. Crystal started going door-to-door throughout our little lakeside community, spreading the word about the dangerous new resident who had suspicious documentation and was probably running some kind of illegal operation. I know this because my next-door neighbor, Bob Fletcher, came over to warn me. Bob's a retired teacher, has been living here for 20 years, and he had the inside scoop on Crystal Stewart that I desperately needed to hear. That woman is absolutely obsessed with this cabin, Bob told me over coffee on my new deck. She used to own it, you know, lost it in a nasty divorce about 3 years ago. Her husband left her for a younger woman, and Crystal had to sell the house to pay for the legal fees. She's never gotten over it. Suddenly, everything started making sense. The way she looked at my cabin, the intimate knowledge of its history, the pure rage in her eyes when she saw me moving in. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. This was personal. Crystal Stewart wanted her house back, and I was standing in the way of that dream. Bob had more intel that made my blood run cold. The weird thing is, he continued, Crystal doesn't actually own the house she's living in now. She's renting it, and she's a fantastic tenant from what I hear. Pays her rent on time every month, takes great care of the property. But here's what's really strange. She never talks about her landlord. Anytime anyone asks about repairs or improvements, she gets all KY and changes the subject. Almost like she doesn't want people to know who owns her place. That afternoon, I decided to do a little investigating of my own. I walked around the neighborhood introducing myself to other residents, and the stories I heard about Crystal Stewart painted a picture of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. She had filed noise complaints against a family with a newborn baby for excessive crying during quiet hours. She had reported an elderly man to the city for having unauthorized garden decorations, which turned out to be 3 tomato plants in his backyard. She had tried to get a veteran fined for flying an American flag that was allegedly too large for community standards. The more I learned about Crystal's behavior, the more I realized I was dealing with someone who used the HOA as her personal weapon of mass destruction. But here's what really got to me. Every single person I talked to mentioned how Crystal always bragged about having connections, about knowing people who could make problems disappear. Just wait until I call my people, she'd tell anyone who challenged her. I have resources you can't even imagine. And it was like she was running some kind of neighborhood protection racket, except she was the one people needed protection from. By Tuesday, Crystal had escalated to full-scale psychological warfare. She had created what she called an evidence collection system for my alleged crimes against the community. She had printed out maps of the neighborhood with my property highlighted in red. She had created a timeline of my suspicious activities, which included such heinous acts as receiving mail delivery at unusual hours. The mailman came at 2 p.m. instead of noon, and allowing unauthorized personnel onto property. I had a pizza delivered. The woman was documenting my every move like I was some kind of international spy. But Crystal's biggest mistake was underestimating the power of modern technology. While she was busy playing neighborhood detective with her amateur surveillance operation, I was installing a professional security system around my property. Ring doorbells, security cameras, motion sensors, the whole 9 yards. And let me tell you, Crystal Stewart was about to provide me with the most incredible collection of evidence any harassment victim has ever compiled. The cameras caught everything. Crystal trespassing on my property at dawn to take pictures of my garbage cans. Crystal is measuring my grass with a ruler to see if it exceeds HOA height limits. Crystal is peeking through my windows with binoculars. Crystal was actually trying to open my car doors to see if she could find evidence of whatever criminal enterprise she was convinced I was running. The woman was completely unhinged, and I was documenting every second of it. Wednesday brought a new level of insanity. Crystal had apparently decided that standard HOA harassment wasn't enough. So, she moved on to social media warfare. She created posts about me on every neighborhood forum she could find, complete with my picture and wild accusations about my character. According to Crystal's online campaign, I was simultaneously running an illegal gambling operation, a drug distribution center, and some kind of identity theft scheme. The woman had quite an imagination. I'll give her that. But here's where Crystal's tech skills really showed their age. Instead of posting these rants in private groups like she intended, she kept posting them publicly where everyone could see them. Her friends, her family, complete strangers. Everyone got to witness Crystal Stewart's complete mental breakdown in real time. The comments section turned into a roast session with people asking if she was feeling okay and suggesting she might want to talk to someone about her obvious obsession with her neighbor. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. The constant harassment, the legal consultations, the stress of having someone documenting my every move, it was taking a toll. My parents kept calling, worried that I'd made a mistake buying the cabin. My girlfriend was questioning whether I should just sell the place and move somewhere else. Everyone was telling me to take the easy way out, but something about Crystal Stewart's behavior was bothering me on a deeper level. This woman was a bully, and if I let her win, she'd just move on to the next victim. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. Thursday morning, I was reviewing my security footage when I saw a property management company truck parked outside Crystal's house. The logo was partially blocked, but I could make out enough letters to know it was some kind of rental management company. A guy in a uniform was walking around the property, taking notes, checking on maintenance issues. Crystal was following him around, talking animatedly, clearly in tenant mode rather than homeowner mode. But when I saw that property management company truck parked outside Crystal's house the next morning, my blood ran cold because I suddenly remembered something about my own rental property. What if this wasn't just a coincidence? Friday morning brought the news I'd been dreading. Crystal had called an emergency neighborhood meeting for that evening, and according to Bob Fletcher, she had convinced quite a few people that I was some kind of genuine threat to the community. I tried to talk sense into them, Bob told me over the phone, his voice heavy with disappointment, but Crystal's got them spooked. She's been showing people photos, telling stories, really working them up. You might want to prepare yourself for a hostile crowd tonight. I hung up, feeling like I was about to walk into my own execution. The stress was eating me alive at this point. I wasn't sleeping. Every little noise outside made me think Crystal was out there with her camera documenting my suspicious activities. I was barely eating because my stomach was in constant knots. My girlfriend had been sending increasingly worried texts that I wasn't answering. And my parents had left 3 voicemails asking if I was okay because apparently I sounded different the last time we talked. Different? Yeah, I felt different. I felt like a man whose peaceful retirement dream had turned into a waking nightmare. And the woman responsible was about to turn the entire neighborhood against me. The community center meeting was like walking into a courtroom where I was already convicted. About 20 people showed up, which Bob said was a record turnout for any HOA meeting in Whispering Pines' history. Crystal had prepared like she was prosecuting a murder case. She had a presentation board covered with photos, printouts, and what she called documented evidence of criminal behavior. Yet, she had copies of her timeline, her violation reports, even screenshots that she'd somehow taken of me talking on my phone while standing on my own deck. The woman had turned stalking into an art form. Ladies and gentlemen, Crystal began, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that belonged in a United Nations Security Council meeting. We are gathered here tonight to address a clear and present danger to our community. This man, she pointed at me like I was patient zero in a zombie apocalypse, has engaged in a pattern of suspicious and potentially illegal activities since the moment he arrived. I have documented proof that he is not who he claims to be, and I believe he represents a significant threat to our property values and our personal safety. The way she said it, you'd think I was running a meth lab instead of trying to enjoy my morning coffee in peace. What followed was 20 minutes of the most surreal insanity I've ever witnessed. Crystal presented her evidence with the confidence of someone who just solved the Kennedy assassination. According to her presentation, my crime spree included receiving packages during unusual hours. The UPS guy came at 2 p.m. instead of 11 a.m. having suspicious phone conversations while walking around my property. I'd called my attorney about her harassment, allowing unauthorized personnel onto my premises. I'd ordered pizza. She had charts, actual charts showing my pattern of criminal activity that looked like something you'd see in a detective movie, except the detective had completely lost their mind. The audience was buying every word of it. I watched in horror as neighbors I'd never even met started nodding along with Crystal's completely unhinged theories. People were taking notes like they were studying for finals. One woman asked if anyone had actually seen me doing normal neighbor activities. Another guy wanted to know why I needed so many security cameras if I wasn't hiding something. It was like watching a town go collectively insane and I was the designated villain in their shared delusion. When Crystal opened the floor for questions, things got even worse. Has anyone seen this man doing anything that looked like regular homeowner behavior? Asked a woman who lived 3 streets over and had probably never even driven past my house. All I ever see him doing is standing on his deck looking around. That's not normal. That's surveillance behavior. Another person chimed in, my daughter was afraid to walk past his house yesterday because he was outside watering his plants. Why would someone need to watch the street while watering plants unless they were casing the neighborhood? I tried defending myself, but every explanation I gave just seemed to make things worse in Crystal's twisted narrative. I was on the phone with my attorney because Crystal Stewart has been harassing me for 4 days, I said. Somehow, in her version of reality, hiring an attorney became evidence of guilt. I installed security cameras because she's been trespassing on my property and taking pictures of me. And apparently protecting myself from a stalker was proof that I was hiding criminal activity. The woman had created a reality where every normal response to her abnormal behavior was evidence that I was the problem. By the time Crystal called for a vote on taking community action to remove this threat, I knew I was completely screwed. 12 people signed a petition demanding that I somehow be forced to sell my property and leave the neighborhood. 12 people who didn't know me, had never spoken to me, and had no idea what Crystal Stewart had put me through for the past 4 days, decided that I was the problem that needed to be solved. They were talking about special assessments, legal action, and even contacting the media to expose the dangerous situation in Whispering Pines. Walking home from that meeting was one of the lowest points of my adult life. The neighbors who had signed that petition were now actively avoiding eye contact with me. Parents started calling their children inside when they saw me coming. People literally crossed the street rather than walk past my house. In less than a week, Crystal Stewart had managed to turn me into the neighborhood pariah. And I had no idea how to fight back against someone who was clearly willing to say or do anything to destroy me. That night, I sat on my deck overlooking the lake, seriously considering whether everyone was right. Maybe I should just admit defeat, sell the cabin, take whatever loss I have to take, and go back to my old life. The legal fees were already piling up. I'd spent $4,000 in 3 days just trying to defend myself against a woman who was essentially waging psychological warfare against me. My dream retirement was turning into the most expensive mistake of my life. And I was starting to think that maybe Crystal Stewart was going to win after all. But as I sat there feeling sorry for myself, something happened that changed everything. The mail truck came by for the evening delivery run and I watched as the driver pulled up to my mailbox. But instead of just dropping off my mail, he walked over to Crystal's house with something in his hand. Then he came back to my mailbox and put something in it. Something that didn't belong to me. Something that was about to blow this whole situation wide open in the most incredible way possible. I waited until the mail truck disappeared around the corner before walking down to check my mailbox. Sure enough, there was a piece of mail that belonged to Crystal Stewart. But it wasn't just any piece of mail. It was a rent check. A rent check made out to Northern Lakes Property Management for $2,200. And as I stood there staring at that check, my hands started shaking because Northern Lakes Property Management wasn't just familiar. It was the name of my own company, the LLC I'd set up 6 months ago to manage my rental property. The company I'd completely forgotten about because I'd been too busy dealing with Crystal's harassment campaign to think about my other investments. Crystal Henderson, not Crystal Stewart. The woman had been using her maiden name on her rental agreements while using her married name everywhere else. And she had been paying rent to my company, to me, for the past 6 months while simultaneously trying to destroy my life. The irony was so perfect, so absolutely insane that I actually started laughing standing there in my driveway at 9 o'clock at night, holding evidence that the woman who had spent 4 days trying to get me arrested had been unknowingly funding her own harassment campaign against me. That's when I found something that made my hands shake. Crystal's rent check, accidentally delivered to my mailbox, was made out to Northern Lakes Property Management. Why did that name sound so familiar? And why did I suddenly feel sick to my stomach? I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent hours staring at that rent check, trying to convince myself that Northern Lakes Property Management was just a common business name, that this was all some impossible coincidence. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew exactly why that name was familiar, and the implications were absolutely insane. Crystal Stewart, the woman who had spent a week trying to destroy my life, had been paying rent to my company for the past 6 months. She had been unknowingly funding her own harassment campaign against me. Saturday morning, I did what I should have done a week ago. I called my attorney, Lisa Parker. "Lisa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to pull up the tenant information for the Northern Lakes property. I think I know who's been renting my house, and if I'm right, this situation just got very interesting." While I waited for Lisa to call me back, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, Crystal's rent check, and my business records, trying to piece together the most twisted landlord-tenant relationship in history. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Jacob," Lisa said, and I could hear the amazement in her voice. "You are not going to believe this. Your tenant's name is Crystal Henderson. She's been renting your property for 6 months, pays $2,200 on the first of every month, has never been late with rent, and has never filed a single complaint or maintenance request. She's literally the perfect tenant, according to the property management company, Crystal Henderson." Crystal Stewart. The woman had apparently kept her maiden name for the rental agreement while using her married name everywhere else. No wonder she had been so secretive about her landlord. She had no idea she was renting from the same guy she was trying to drive out of the neighborhood. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on both of us. But while I was processing this incredible discovery, Crystal was launching what she clearly intended to be her final assault on my life in Whispering Pines. Saturday afternoon, she filed a formal complaint with the State Business Licensing Board, claiming that I was running an illegal commercial operation out of a residential property. She had apparently spent Friday night after the neighborhood meeting researching every possible way to get me in trouble with government authorities. The complaint she filed was a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Crystal's version of events, I was operating some kind of unlicensed consulting business out of my cabin, holding illegal meetings with clients and associates, and violating multiple zoning regulations. Her evidence consisted of photos of delivery trucks, screenshots of phone calls I'd made while standing on my own property, and her own testimony about unusual activity patterns consistent with commercial rather than residential use. Sunday morning brought even more escalation. Crystal had apparently decided that government harassment wasn't enough, so she was moving on to media warfare. She had contacted every local news outlet she could find, pitching them a story about a dangerous criminal who had infiltrated their quiet lakeside community through fraudulent documentation and possible identity theft. Most of the news stations ignored her, but one of the local papers actually sent someone out to investigate. The reporter was a young guy who seemed genuinely confused about why he'd been assigned to cover what appeared to be a straightforward neighbor dispute. He interviewed Crystal first, and I could hear her through my windows, giving him the full performance about community safety and property values and the need to protect innocent families from predatory individuals. Then he knocked on my door, and I could tell within about 30 seconds that he thought the whole story was ridiculous. "Look, Mr. Mitchell," the reporter said after I'd shown him my documentation and explained the situation. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, and I've seen a lot of neighbor disputes. This lady seems to have some kind of personal problem with you, but there's no story here. You bought a house. She doesn't like it. End of story." But Crystal wasn't done with her media campaign. When the paper refused to run her story, she moved on to social media, creating post after post about the dangerous situation in Whispering Pines. By Monday morning, Crystal had convinced herself that she was some kind of investigative journalist exposing a major criminal conspiracy. She had created what she called a comprehensive case file against me, complete with photos, timelines, witness statements, and her own analysis of what she believed was my criminal behavior. She was posting updates multiple times a day, treating the whole situation like she was running her own personal news network dedicated to the Jacob Mitchell crime syndicate. But Crystal's biggest mistake was getting overconfident. Monday afternoon, she made the phone call that would end her harassment campaign forever. She called my property management company directly, claiming to be a concerned citizen with information about their client, Jacob Mitchell. She told them that said, "We just got a very strange call from someone claiming you're under criminal investigation. We wanted to verify that everything is okay with your account and make sure there aren't any legal issues we need to know about." I explained the situation, and there was a long pause before the property manager spoke again. "Sir," she said slowly, "the woman who called us about you was Crystal Henderson. She's been your tenant for 6 months. She's been calling to complain about her own landlord." The property manager was as stunned as I was. In 20 years of managing rental properties, I have never seen anything like this. This woman has been paying you rent while simultaneously trying to get you in trouble with government agencies. This is beyond bizarre. That afternoon, I made the decision that would change everything. I was done being reactive. I was done letting Crystal Stewart control the narrative. It was time to flip the script and show her exactly who she'd been messing with for the past week. I called Lisa Parker and told her to prepare eviction paperwork based on the tenants' harassment of the landlord. I called Officer Harris and asked him to be present for what I described as a very important landlord-tenant meeting. And then I called the property management company and scheduled a meeting with my tenant Crystal Henderson for the next morning. Tell her that the property owner wants to meet with her to discuss some issues that have come to our attention. I instructed the property manager. "You are not going to believe this. Your tenant's name is Crystal Henderson. She's been renting your property for 6 months, pays $2,200 on the first of every month, has never been late with rent, and has never filed a single complaint or maintenance request. She's literally the perfect tenant, according to the property management company, Crystal Henderson." Crystal Stewart. The woman had apparently kept her maiden name for the rental agreement while using her married name everywhere else. No wonder she had been so secretive about her landlord. She had no idea she was renting from the same guy she was trying to drive out of the neighborhood. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on both of us. But while I was processing this incredible discovery, Crystal was launching what she clearly intended to be her final assault on my life in Whispering Pines. Saturday afternoon, she filed a formal complaint with the State Business Licensing Board, claiming that I was running an illegal commercial operation out of a residential property. She had apparently spent Friday night after the neighborhood meeting researching every possible way to get me in trouble with government authorities. The complaint she filed was a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Crystal's version of events, I was operating some kind of unlicensed consulting business out of my cabin, holding illegal meetings with clients and associates, and violating multiple zoning regulations. Her evidence consisted of photos of delivery trucks, screenshots of phone calls I'd made while standing on my own property, and her own testimony about unusual activity patterns consistent with commercial rather than residential use. Sunday morning brought even more escalation. Crystal had apparently decided that government harassment wasn't enough, so she was moving on to media warfare. She had contacted every local news outlet she could find, pitching them a story about a dangerous criminal who had infiltrated their quiet lakeside community through fraudulent documentation and possible identity theft. Most of the news stations ignored her, but one of the local papers actually sent someone out to investigate. The reporter was a young guy who seemed genuinely confused about why he'd been assigned to cover what appeared to be a straightforward neighbor dispute. He interviewed Crystal first, and I could hear her through my windows, giving him the full performance about community safety and property values and the need to protect innocent families from predatory individuals. Then he knocked on my door, and I could tell within about 30 seconds that he thought the whole story was ridiculous. "Look, Mr. Mitchell," the reporter said after I'd shown him my documentation and explained the situation. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, and I've seen a lot of neighbor disputes. This lady seems to have some kind of personal problem with you, but there's no story here. You bought a house. She doesn't like it. End of story." But Crystal wasn't done with her media campaign. When the paper refused to run her story, she moved on to social media, creating post after post about the dangerous situation in Whispering Pines. By Monday morning, Crystal had convinced herself that she was some kind of investigative journalist exposing a major criminal conspiracy. She had created what she called a comprehensive case file against me, complete with photos, timelines, witness statements, and her own analysis of what she believed was my criminal behavior. She was posting updates multiple times a day, treating the whole situation like she was running her own personal news network dedicated to the Jacob Mitchell crime syndicate. But Crystal's biggest mistake was getting overconfident. Monday afternoon, she made the phone call that would end her harassment campaign forever. She called my property management company directly, claiming to be a concerned citizen with information about their client, Jacob Mitchell. She told them that said, "We just got a very strange call from someone claiming you're under criminal investigation. We wanted to verify that everything is okay with your account and make sure there aren't any legal issues we need to know about." I explained the situation, and there was a long pause before the property manager spoke again. "Sir," she said slowly, "the woman who called us about you was Crystal Henderson. She's been your tenant for 6 months. She's been calling to complain about her own landlord." The property manager was as stunned as I was. In 20 years of managing rental properties, I have never seen anything like this. This woman has been paying you rent while simultaneously trying to get you in trouble with government agencies. This is beyond bizarre. That afternoon, I made the decision that would change everything. I was done being reactive. I was done letting Crystal Stewart control the narrative. It was time to flip the script and show her exactly who she'd been messing with for the past week. I called Lisa Parker and told her to prepare eviction paperwork based on the tenants' harassment of the landlord. I called Officer Harris and asked him to be present for what I described as a very important landlord-tenant meeting. And then I called the property management company and scheduled a meeting with my tenant Crystal Henderson for the next morning. Tell her that the property owner wants to meet with her to discuss some issues that have come to our attention. I instructed the property manager. Don't give her any other details. Just tell her that it's important that she be there and that she might want to bring any documentation she has regarding her tenancy. Now, the property manager agreed to set up the meeting, though she was clearly confused about what was going on. As I prepared for the meeting that would reveal the truth to Crystal Stewart, I couldn't help but think about the incredible chain of events that had led to this moment. A week ago, I was just a guy moving into his retirement cabin. Now, I was about to sit down with my tenant and explain to her that she'd been paying rent to the man she'd spent 7 days trying to destroy. The woman who thought she held all the power in this relationship was about to discover that I literally owned the roof over her head. I had checked my bank account. I had confirmed the impossible. But now I had to make the hardest decision of my life. How do you tell someone they've been paying rent to their worst enemy for 6 months? And what would Crystal do when she found out the truth? Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually makes everything feel like a fresh start. But as I walked across the street to Crystal's house for our scheduled meeting, I felt like I was walking toward the most surreal confrontation in real estate history. Officer Harris was already there, looking confused but professional as always. The property manager, Jennifer, was waiting by her car with a folder full of documentation. And somewhere inside that house, Crystal Stewart was about to get the shock of her life. I had decided on my approach the night before. I wasn't going to be dramatic or vengeful. I was just going to present the facts calmly and let Crystal process the reality of what she'd done to herself. The woman had spent a week trying to destroy me, not knowing that every rent check she wrote was helping to pay for the very legal defense I was using against her harassment. The irony was so perfect that I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Crystal opened the door wearing her best "I'm meeting with important people" outfit, a business suit that was probably left over from her working days, and an expression of smug confidence that told me she thought this meeting was going to end with her victory over the neighborhood menace. "Where exactly is the property owner?" she asked, looking past me like I was just some kind of assistant who had tagged along to take notes. "I was told this was an urgent meeting about my tenant, and I have some very serious concerns to discuss." "Crystal," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "I am the property owner. You've been my tenant for 6 months. Northern Lakes Property Management is my company, and you've been paying rent to me since you moved into this house." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Crystal stared at me for a long moment, her brain clearly trying to process information that didn't make any sense within her understanding of reality. "That's impossible," she said. But her voice had lost its confident edge. "Northern Lakes is a legitimate property management company. You're just some criminal who bought a house with fraudulent documentation. There's no way you could own my house. That's absolutely impossible." But even as she was denying it, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. The woman was smart enough to know that I wouldn't be making this claim unless I had proof. And she was starting to realize that her perfect plan had somehow gone horribly wrong. Officer Harris stepped forward with the documentation I'd brought. Bank statements showing 6 months of $2,200 deposits from Crystal Henderson. The original purchase agreement for the house she was standing in. Property tax records list Northern Lakes Property Management as the owner. Her own rental application with her signature at the bottom. The lease agreement she'd signed 6 months ago agreeing to pay rent to the company she now knew belonged to me. "Ma'am," Officer Harris said gently, "these documents appear to be legitimate. Mr. Mitchell owns this property through his company, and according to these bank records, you've been paying him rent for 6 months. Is there any part of this you'd like to dispute?" Crystal grabbed the papers from his hands and stared at them like she was trying to make the words change through sheer force of will. Her face went through every emotion possible. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of desperate panic as the reality of the situation hit her. "This has to be some kind of setup," she said, her voice getting higher and shakier. "He must have forged these documents. He probably hacked into my bank account and created fake transactions. There's no way I've been paying rent to this criminal for 6 months. That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible." But the evidence was overwhelming, and even Crystal couldn't maintain her denial in the face of her own signature on legal documents. The property manager opened her folder and pulled out copies of every interaction Crystal had ever had with the management company. 6 months of on-time rent payments, multiple approvals for minor modifications to the property, even a complimentary review Crystal had written about how professional and responsive her property management company was. "Mrs. Henderson," Jennifer said softly, "you've been an exemplary tenant. You've never complained about the landlord, never requested any major repairs, and you even sent us a thank you card last Christmas for being so easy to work with." That's when Crystal completely lost it. She started screaming about conspiracy theories and fraud, and how this was all impossible because she knew I was some kind of criminal mastermind who had somehow infiltrated her life. She grabbed her own evidence binder, the one she'd been planning to use to prove my criminal behavior, and started throwing papers around as if destroying her surveillance documentation would somehow make this whole situation go away. "You planned this?" she screamed at me. You somehow found out where I lived and you bought my house just to torment me. This is all some elaborate revenge scheme because I was trying to protect my neighborhood from you." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. But Crystal was clearly having some kind of psychological break, and I was starting to feel genuinely sorry for her despite everything she'd put me through. Officer Harris tried to calm her down. But Crystal was beyond reason. She was convinced that I had somehow orchestrated this entire situation as part of some master plan to destroy her life. In her mind, it was more believable that I was some kind of criminal genius who had manipulated property records and bank statements than that she had simply been renting a house from someone she didn't know. The woman had spent so much time creating conspiracy theories about me that she couldn't accept a simple coincidence when it hit her in the face. That's when I pulled out the eviction notice. "Crystal," I said, "as your landlord, I'm giving you 30 days notice to vacate the property. The reason for eviction is harassment of the landlord and other tenants, filing false reports with government agencies, and creating a hostile environment for other residents of the community. You have 30 days to find alternative housing." The document made everything official. Crystal Stewart, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, was being evicted by the man she'd spent a week trying to drive out of town. Crystal stared at the eviction notice like it was written in a foreign language. "You can't evict me," she said weakly. "I'm the perfect tenant. I pay my rent on time. I take care of the property. You can't evict someone for trying to protect their neighborhood." But Officer Harris was already explaining her legal situation. The harassment, the false reports to government agencies, the campaign to damage my reputation, all of it constituted lease violations that provided legal grounds for eviction. As the reality of her situation sank in, Crystal made one last desperate attempt to salvage some kind of victory from the wreckage of her campaign against me. "Fine," she said, trying to regain her composure. "I'll move out, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are. I'm going to tell the whole world about this situation and how you manipulated everything to get revenge on an innocent woman who was just trying to protect her community." And little did Crystal know, she was about to become an internet sensation, but not in the way she was planning. But as I watched Crystal get handcuffed in the house she'd been renting from me, I realized something terrifying. This was just the beginning. What happens when the internet gets hold of a story about a Karen who paid rent to her own victim? Was I ready for what came next? Within 6 hours of Crystal's eviction notice being served, 3 different videos of our landlord-tenant revelation were already spreading across social media. Like wildfire. Officer Martinez had allowed the property manager to film the meeting for legal documentation purposes, but somehow that footage ended up online. One of Crystal's neighbors had been recording from their window when she started screaming about conspiracies and throwing papers around. Even Crystal herself had apparently live-streamed part of her meltdown, thinking she was documenting her own victimization, not realizing she was creating evidence of her complete mental breakdown. The internet loves a good karma story, but this was karma on steroids with a side of cosmic justice and a cherry of pure irony on top. Woman Harris's neighbor for a week finds out he's her landlord was trending on every platform within 12 hours. The videos were being shared, remixed, commented on, and turned into memes faster than I could keep track of. Crystal's face became the new symbol for people who create their own problems and then act shocked. Absolutely shocked when those problems explode in their faces like a defective firework. I'm not going to lie, watching the view counts climb into the millions was both thrilling and terrifying. This was way bigger than just a neighborhood dispute. Now, what made the story absolutely perfect for internet consumption was the sheer absurdity of Crystal's behavior throughout the week. People were digging up her social media posts from the past 7 days. And when you looked at the timeline of her harassment campaign altogether, it was like watching someone systematically destroy their own life in real time. Day 1, dangerous criminal moves into neighborhood. Day 2, suspicious activity involving furniture delivery. Day 3, possible illegal operation based on number of visitors. Day 7, oh wait, I've been paying this guy rent for 6 months. You literally cannot make this stuff up. The morning shows picked up the story by Wednesday, and suddenly I was getting calls from news producers who wanted to interview me about the landlord Karen situation. Good Morning America wanted me to appear via satellite. The local news wanted to do a follow-up story. Some true crime podcasters were reaching out, though honestly I'm not sure what crimes they thought had been committed beyond Crystal's assault on common sense and basic human decency. My phone was ringing so much I had to turn off notifications just to get some peace. But the real explosion happened when people started digging into Crystal's background and finding out about her pattern of harassment toward other residents. Remember that veteran I mentioned, the one she'd reported for his American flag? He came forward with his story, and it turned out Crystal had been making his life hell for 2 years. The family with a newborn baby shared their experience with Crystal's noise complaints about excessive crying during quiet hours, because apparently babies are supposed to schedule their crying around HOA regulations. The elderly man with the tomato plants posted pictures of the violation notices he'd received for unauthorized agriculture. Suddenly, Crystal Stewart wasn't just a Karen who had made one spectacular mistake. She was a serial neighborhood terrorizer who had finally met her match. The comment sections on these videos were absolutely brutal. And I mean that in the most entertaining way possible. People were calling Crystal everything from the dumbest person alive to a masterclass in self-destruction. Someone had created a timeline of her rent payments alongside her harassment campaign, showing exactly how much money she'd paid me while simultaneously trying to get me arrested. $2,200 times 6 months. She had literally funded my legal defense against her own harassment to the tune of $13,200. The math was so perfect, it felt like the universe had a degree in accounting. By Thursday, Crystal had achieved what internet experts call main character of the day status. That special honor reserved for people who do something so spectacularly stupid that the entire internet stops what it's doing to point and laugh. Her name was being used as a verb. Don't Crystal Stewart yourself became shorthand for don't spend months undermining someone who actually has power over your life. The local businesses were putting up signs saying Crystal Stewart not welcome here as a joke. Though I suspected some of them were only half kidding. The hardware store down the street had a sign that read security cameras available. Protect yourself from your tenants. The legal consequences started piling up almost as fast as the internet fame. The State Business Licensing Board dropped their investigation into my illegal commercial activities when they realized the complaint had been filed by someone who was literally paying me rent while claiming I was a criminal mastermind. The local police department issued a statement saying that Crystal had filed multiple false reports and would be facing charges for harassment and making false statements to government officials. Officer Martinez told me later that he'd never seen a case where someone had documented their own criminal behavior so thoroughly while thinking they were building a case against someone else. Crystal herself seemed to be handling her internet fame about as well as you'd expect. Someone who had spent a week creating elaborate conspiracy theories would handle suddenly being the most famous person on the internet for being spectacularly wrong about everything. She tried to control the narrative by posting her own version of events, but every statement she made just added fuel to the fire. Her explanation that she was trying to protect the community from a suspicious individual fell completely flat when people could see the bank records showing she'd been paying that suspicious individual's mortgage for 6 months. The property management company was fielding calls from journalists asking about their most famous landlord-tenant relationship. Other landlords started sharing their own stories of difficult tenants, but none of them had quite the same level of ironic justice that Crystal's situation provided. Real estate professionals were using our story as a case study in why thorough background checks and proper communication are essential in property management. Someone actually created a presentation titled "How Not to Harass Your Own Landlord" that was making the rounds in property management circles. Friday brought the news that Crystal had hired an attorney to try to fight the eviction, but her legal position was basically hopeless. She had documented her own harassment campaign so thoroughly that she'd created a prosecutor's dream case against herself. Her social media posts, her violation reports, her calls to government agencies, it was all there in black and white, time-stamped and screenshot for posterity. Her lawyer was reportedly trying to negotiate some kind of settlement that would allow her to leave quietly without admitting fault, but the damage to her reputation was already done. Everyone in a 50 miles radius knew exactly who Crystal Stewart was and what she'd done. The neighborhood was experiencing its own transformation in the wake of Crystal's internet fame. Property values were actually going up because people wanted to live in the community that had produced the most famous landlord-tenant story in social media history. The HOA was getting calls from people who wanted to move to Whispering Pines specifically because they'd heard about our character and thought it sounded like an interesting place to live. Bob Fletcher had been elected as the new HOA president in an emergency election, and his first act was to revise the community guidelines to prevent future Crystal Stewart situations. Local businesses were capitalizing on our sudden fame by creating themed promotions that were both hilarious and slightly mean-spirited. The hardware store was advertising security cameras to protect yourself from your tenants. And at the local coffee shop had created a drink called the Crystal Stewart. It was bitter, overpriced, and left a bad taste in your mouth. Even the post office was getting in on the joke with clerks asking people if they wanted to make sure their mail was going to the right address so they didn't accidentally discover they were renting from their worst enemy. As for me, I was trying to process the fact that my quiet retirement had turned into the most public landlord-tenant dispute in internet history. My phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and even a few Hollywood producers who thought our story would make a great movie. The whole situation was surreal, but I had to admit there was something deeply satisfying about watching Crystal face the consequences of her actions on such a public stage. For a week, she had tried to destroy my reputation and run me out of town. Now the entire internet knew exactly what kind of person she really was. But as the week progressed and the story continued to spread across every platform imaginable, I started to feel a little uncomfortable with how brutal the internet was being toward Crystal. Yes, she had harassed me relentlessly for a week. Yes, she had tried to destroy my reputation and get me in legal trouble based on nothing but her own paranoid fantasies. But watching someone's life implode in real time on social media was harder to enjoy than I had expected. The woman was clearly having some kind of psychological crisis and the whole world was watching her fall apart. 10 million views in 24 hours. National news calling my phone. Crystal's face becoming a global meme. But as I watched her world crumble, I started wondering, had I gone too far? What happens when justice becomes revenge? And why did I suddenly feel like I was the one who might need to be worried? Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually makes everything feel like a fresh start. But as I stood on my deck watching Crystal Stewart load boxes into a moving truck across the street, I felt like I was witnessing the end of the most surreal week of my entire life. There she was packing up her belongings from the house I owned while I watched from the cabin she tried to force me to sell. If that's not cosmic justice, I don't know what is. The universe really does have a twisted sense of humor sometimes, and this whole situation felt like karma had been taking notes for months, just waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the punchline. Crystal had managed to find a new place about 40 mi away in some tiny town where she probably thought she could escape her internet fame. Good luck with that, lady. In the age of social media, there's really nowhere to hide when you become a viral sensation for harassing your own landlord. The Landlord Karen videos were still getting shared thousands of times a day, and Crystal Stewart had officially entered the Hall of Fame of people who created their own disasters and then acted shocked when those disasters exploded in their faces. She was going to be the cautionary tale people referenced for years whenever someone needed an example of how spectacularly wrong things can go when you mess with people without knowing who you're dealing with. The legal stuff got wrapped up surprisingly fast once Crystal's lawyer realized his client had basically documented her own harassment campaign so thoroughly that fighting the eviction would be like arguing that water isn't wet. We reached a settlement where Crystal would move out voluntarily, pay me $12,000 for harassment and the headache of dealing with her insanity, and agreed to a restraining order that kept her at least 500 feet away from both my properties. In return, I agreed not to sue her into complete financial oblivion, though the criminal charges for filing false police reports were still working their way through the court system. Her lawyer actually thanked me for being remarkably reasonable given the circumstances, which I think was professional code for your client is completely insane and you're lucky this guy doesn't want to destroy her life completely. Watching Crystal pack her stuff was like watching the final episode of a really weird reality show where the villain finally gets what's coming to them. This woman had been the perfect tenant for 6 months before she found out I owned her house. 6 months of on-time rent payments, 0 complaints, not a single maintenance request. Hell, she even sent the property management company a Christmas card thanking them for being so professional. If she had just minded her own business and let me move into my cabin in peace, we could have kept that landlord-tenant relationship going indefinitely without either of us ever knowing about the connection. But Crystal Stewart wasn't capable of minding her own business, and that character flaw had cost her literally everything. The neighborhood transformation over the past week had been absolutely incredible to witness. Property values shot up by 10% because people wanted to live in the community that produced the most famous landlord-tenant story in social media history. I'm not kidding. Realtors were actually using our story as a selling point. Come live in Whispering Pines, where even the neighborhood drama has a happy ending. The new HOA leadership had implemented common-sense policies to prevent future harassment situations, and the general vibe was friendlier and more welcoming than anyone could remember it being in years. Turns out removing one toxic person from a position of power is like removing cancer from the whole community. Bob Fletcher stopped by that afternoon with updates on the latest neighborhood developments. And man, the stories that were coming out now that people felt safe to speak up. You know, Bob said, settling into my deck chair with a beer. I never told you this, but Crystal tried to get me to sign that petition against you by threatening to report me for my bird feeders. Said they were attracting nuisance wildlife and creating health hazards. The woman was running this place like her own personal dictatorship, and everybody was too scared to cross her because she'd make your life hell if you didn't fall in line. The veteran with the American flag had been targeted because Crystal disagreed with his politics. The family with the baby got harassed because she couldn't stand the sound of children being children. The old guy with the tomato plants got reported because Crystal thought vegetable gardens were low class and hurt property values. 3 months later, I hosted the first annual Whispering Pines community barbecue right here at my lake cabin, and nearly 60 people showed up. 60 people, including several families who had moved to the neighborhood specifically because they'd heard about our community transformation and wanted to be part of something positive. The whole thing was everything Crystal's HOA meetings never were. Welcoming, fun, and actually focused on bringing people together instead of finding new ways to make everyone miserable. Kids were running around playing. Adults were actually talking to each other like human beings. And everyone seemed genuinely happy to be part of a community that had learned to stand up to bullies and come out stronger on the other side. The house Crystal vacated got rented to this amazing young family with twin toddlers who absolutely love their lakefront location. The dad's a teacher, the mom's a nurse, and their kids are exactly the kind of happy, noisy presence that would have sent Crystal into a complete meltdown. But the new HOA leadership welcomed them with open arms, and they have quickly become one of the most popular families in the area. Those kids are living proof that communities thrive when you focus on what brings people together instead of what drives them apart. I still get updates about Crystal through the internet grapevine that made her famous. And apparently she's working retail in her new town, living in a small apartment and keeping a much lower profile than she maintained here. The viral videos created a permanent digital record that's going to follow her around forever. But people seem to be moving on to newer internet drama, and her 15 minutes of fame are gradually fading into meme history. Sometimes I wonder if she learned anything from this whole experience, but honestly, I'm just grateful she's someone else's problem now. The math of our situation never stops being hilarious to me. Crystal paid me $13,200 in rent over 6 months while simultaneously trying to get me arrested, investigated by government agencies, and driven out of the community. She literally funded her own harassment campaign against me, paying for the legal defense I used to fight every single one of her accusations. Business schools are actually using our story as a case study and why you should always know who you're dealing with before you declare war on them. There's probably some college kid right now writing a paper about how Crystal Stewart became the perfect example of what happens when your emotions override basic common sense. Looking back on this whole insane experience, I learned that sometimes the best response to a bully is just to let them destroy themselves. Crystal was so convinced that I was the villain in her personal drama that she never stopped to consider that she might be completely wrong about everything. Her obsession with controlling the narrative blinded her to the reality of her own situation. And that blindness cost her everything she thought she was fighting to protect. The woman spent more energy trying to get rid of me than most people spend on their actual jobs. And all she accomplished was evicting herself from a great rental situation and becoming internet famous for all the wrong reasons. 6 months after Crystal's dramatic exit, Whispering Pines has become exactly the kind of community I dreamed about when I bought my cabin. Neighbors actually look out for each other instead of looking for reasons to file complaints. The HOA focuses on real community improvements instead of petty power trips and harassment campaigns. New residents consistently tell us how impressed they are with how welcoming and friendly everyone is here. We've become living proof that removing one person who thrives on drama and conflict can completely transform an entire community for the better. So, there you have it. The story of how Crystal Stewart spent 6 months unknowingly paying rent to the man she tried to destroy. She funded her own harassment case to the tune of $13,200. And all she got for her trouble was an eviction notice and permanent internet infamy. The lesson here is pretty simple. Always check who owns your house before you declare war on your neighbors. And maybe, just maybe, try minding your own business once in a while. You never know when that stranger you're harassing might turn out to be the person who controls whether you have a roof over your head. And that's a wrap on this absolutely wild story here at Echo Stories. If this cosmic karma tale got your blood pumping, smash that like button because trust me, we've got more insane real-life stories coming your way. I'm Jacob and I'll catch you in the next video where we dive into another unbelievable tale of justice served cold. Until then, keep those stories coming.